questions that I'm going to start off with for our speakers up here that kind of go through each principle. And then after that, I'm going to open it up to conversation and continued question and answer for all of you guys. So the first principle is to advocate with those who have a limited voice in public life. And my question, I guess, for each of these speakers is to tell us more about kind of who those groups or communities are with a limited voice and what assets that those people have or those communities have that they've brought to the table in your experience. So if anyone wants to start with that, or I'm thinking maybe Ingrid, folks that have a limited voice in government, or you're kind of no influence type of folks, or
absolutely, yeah.
Oh, is that on? Make sure that they're on in the on position.
Hello. Yes. Okay. Yes. Good question. So we, as my presentation may have shown you, work with a range of groups, from grassroots tenant organizing projects throughout New York City to legal services organizations and direct services. And as far as the assets that those folks bring to the table, I don't know that I can, quantify them quickly or, succinctly, because, I mean, first and foremost, a true understanding of what's going on in their neighborhoods, not kind of impeded by, city politics. It's pretty clear when you sit down and talk to folks about what's going on in their neighborhood that they are the experts, right? And then also from the design perspective, I know this is a cliche by now, but fresh eyes, and good sense of humor, and depending on the group that we're working with, unvarnished criticism, which is really good to have, especially for folks who don't have preconceived notions about how a design process goes. It's especially rewarding to work with people who will give it to you, say it like it is. So yeah, those are just a few things that come to mind, but again, I don't think I could kind of capture all of the many things that are beneficial about working directly with the people you're trying to serve.
I certainly think the first principle really is a wonderful, exemplifies what you all do so well. And, you didn't say it exactly this way, I don't think, but knowledge is power, and sort of how can you give some power to, I keep forgetting what's at the bottom of your chart. Something. No influence. So how can you, with an 8-person organization, how can you give power to people who have no influence? And so it's a wonderful advocacy. It's very wonderful to see and very well targeted.
Yeah, and in terms of advocating with folks, that often involves building a lot of trust with communities that you work with. So I'm wondering kind of how that trust gets built and what kind of persistence is necessary. Brian, you talked a lot about working with migrant workers. You have to engage them in a certain way in order to build that trust and have that kind of conversation that was necessary to inform design. So could you talk a little bit more about maybe the tools you use to build trust or the values that you need to bring to the table to build that trust?
I mean, the great model for me, really from my very beginning in this work, is Maurice Cox and his work in Bayview, where the first thing he did was a trash cleanup with the community. And, I think what that taught me was if we put our own agenda aside and do something that's totally not within our agenda, but something for the community, and in a way that was wonderful about it is in a sort of humbling way. If you know Maurice, he's very urbane and, sophisticated. So I think for the community to see him out there collecting trash was a really important way for him to say, I'm not just here to be Dick and put my, slap my design on top of you, which is what had happened to them. They were getting Cole was listening to the radio, and she heard they were putting a maximum security prison across the street from her. And all the politicians was like, oh, this will be jobs. And Alice was like, well, so you say, jobs for who? And maybe we don't want that across the street from us. So that is a great model of Dick, who the politicians think, oh, this is a great solution for this community. But then working with Maurice, they came up with a different idea of what they wanted. So, but Maurice not only did the trash pickup, but then his meetings were, they were never called meetings. First of all, they were called potlucks or porch gatherings or worship services. He would go to their, so he always went to their type of venue, he didn't hold a meeting, but he would show up with some big pads to, talk about design with them.
I think with Serve Denton, one of the things that they really wanted to focus on was creating an environment where the clients, those who were coming to receive services, would feel valued. Because many times in the situations that these people found themselves, they had lost all value in society. And so that was a real kind of crucial element, and something we talked a lot about when we were working on the design, because on one side, they wanted to be very welcoming. On the other side, there's a lot of security issues. And how do you kind of make that look, how do you, those are not necessarily in tandem with each other a lot of times. And so one of the solutions that we all came up with was this idea of the entryway being kind of a living room space. And the idea is to come in, it's a space where people can just come in and sit and relax and not even be getting services that during the, that time. And be a place for conversation starting. And for them to come and work out, different things. And the color schemes, the warmth of the environment. So often a lot of service places are very cold, they're gray, they're ugly looking. They don't inspire you to want to stick around and stay, probably because they don't want you to stick around and stay for that long. So we looked at using, leather furniture and things that would be like a living room type space that would encourage lingering. And that was a kind of an important part of the design that would build trust within that community that this is an okay place where you are valued, where you can feel welcomed for whatever reason you needed to be there. So that was one way we addressed that.
I'm thinking of a previous project we did about 15 years ago called Mothers United. And it actually started out as young mothers, but by the time the project got farther along, it took so long, it just ended up being Mothers United. But it was basically a group of mothers in the neighborhood of Humboldt Park working in with Lucha, Latin United Community Housing Association, who found the rental units to be very subpar for single moms with children. And on their own, they didn't represent anything, but once they banded together and approached Lucha with this issue, suddenly they were a voice, and a very strong voice. And we searched we worked with the alderman and through the community and looked for various sites that would be appropriate. A lot of the sites, the rest of the community turned down for one reason or another, or we didn't get the lots per the city. And eventually we did get some scattered sites, and we had a lot of sessions to understand what the type of housing that they wanted, and then those were built. And in the end, the alderman, who's the local representative for the ward in Chicago, it was a big success. And again, they're powerful. They're a voting bloc. They're mothers. They have a very strong voice. And he's now a congressman. So you do have a voice. You're voting if you do a project that has a lot of community support. You have political support, and I think that was. It's pretty amazing to see that someone starting from a very local level politically can reach, to be a U.S. congressman. And again, these mothers, by banding together, had a very strong voice who alone didn't have much of a voice at all.
So I guess my next question, going into Principle 2 in making decisions, what are some of the tools that you guys do or use once you get community stakeholders around the table, once you get groups involved? How do you get input out of those groups, or what are some maybe common tools that you found between the different presentations that you saw? Anything stand out?
I'll start with that. A lot of workshops. Just a lot of those tables with a lot of plans and ideas, and what do you want? What's the input? What's good about it? What's bad? we'll design something. I mean, we end up doing, 3 to 4 community meetings, like interior community meetings, and then presenting what has been designed to the broader community. So the neighbors have a say too, and they may not like certain things, or they may like certain things. And again, the alderman has a say. So it's a lot of discussions, a lot of redesign and refinement of design and feedback, both ways.
We found that when we had a very large cross-section of people at our day-long workshop, and they were not necessarily people who would have talked to each other unless that had happened. And like I said, the only voice we were really missing out of that whole cross-section were the client voices. But other than that, we had city people who would make decisions. We had nonprofit leaders who made the decisions, and we had board members from the parent organization that were making decisions. And normally they would have held several different charrettes to involve these different stakeholders. And what we did was bring everyone together so that the people from the food bank could hear what the board members were concerned about, and the board members could hear what the city was concerned about. And so that was really beneficial because it kind of cut out several different other times when we would have had to go and say, what do you think? And then we might have had to change something, whereas they started to work together or see each other's points related to the other. And that was really awesome from a planning standpoint, because then we could move forward faster on that decision making because everyone was talking together. So I think the more often you can get everyone into one, it can be kind of messy and people might not agree with each other. But I think that's a lot, more beneficial than having to do it several different times, if that's possible.
So let me mention a tool I use to get a bunch of design students to agree on a single design in the end of the day. So what we do is every day we come in and we have a pinup. And this is when we're doing this full time, like in the summertime. And then each person explains their idea. Then we go around the room and each person says ideas that they see that they like. They can mention as many ideas as they want to. They can't talk about their own project, and they can't say anything negative. And every person has a chance to talk. And by the end of that round, it's clear which ideas are better among the group. Those ideas move forward. The other ones face Darwinian extinction, and they don't move forward. But you do this daily, and then everybody's free to work on those good ideas and iterate them, and guess what? Make them their own, right? You still have the other person's idea in there, and by the time you do this for 2 weeks or so, everybody's got plenty of ideas in there, but nobody owns the idea by themselves. Now, guess what? This doesn't just work with design students. You can actually bring anybody into that conversation, say what they value in the ideas presented, and have the good ideas emerge. And this is something I learned from Sambo. When I started teaching the rural studio, I said, Sambo, how do you get such great work out of these students? I know they're Auburn students, and they're good, and she's particularly good right there, but she did the rural studio. But, they do amazing work. And I'd never taught before, and this is the only thing he told me before I started teaching. He said, we beat the bushes until the good ideas come up, and then we grab them. So that's that process. Notice he said we, even though he's won every award there, he didn't do the design. It was a collective, and he was wise enough to realize everybody has a good idea at some point to throw into the project, and it's sort of iterating. So anyway. So that's one tool we use.
I'm going to piggyback off that a little bit, and then also say that I think what I'm about to say is a contradiction in terms, so stay with me. But I think when working with communities to get feedback, doing as much prep and like kind of being as explicit about the process and what's going to go down and how they can contribute is important. And talking through that, because it may be an experience that no one's had before. Again, there may be, you know, what's a charrette? What, again, always go back to typeface, which is an unnecessarily complex word, but necessary, right? So being as explicit as you can when you're working with communities about like how to participate in that process. So preparation in that sense, which I think is probably different than when you're working in a studio with students or in a firm, you know, with your team. But then also, so preparing, but then not preparing so much that you feel like you have to prepare before you open yourself up to feedback, if that makes sense. So, and by that I mean like some of the best kind of informal opportunities we've had to get project feedback. Maybe it's like right as the office is closing at 6 and I pull in someone from another department, or it's, you know, asking our community partners, do you have some clients around today? Or do you have another staff member who just wants to come and sit down and weigh in? Finding those small opportunities. It doesn't have to be a full-blown affair that's perfectly planned to get really good feedback. So kind of trying to keep that tension at play, I think.
So how is some of that feedback integrated in the design process that you guys utilize? Are there any examples you can think of I changed this aspect because of this comment or this the result of this activity that comes to mind? Just throw that out for you.
I guess I can start with that all the time, in every project, multiple times. I'm thinking of just one like really minor and specific instance where we were asked to revise how we did the front stairs on a project where in the past you could see like which door was, say, in a 3 units stacked on top of each other, which unit was for the door, and this was for the Mothers United project. And in that neighborhood, they still felt there was a security risk, and we've had a couple really harsh winters too. So those you know, one full flight of exterior stairs has become very difficult in these kind of conditions. So changing that to one central front door, so the stair you could go in that door and no one knew which unit you went into, and then it was also weatherized, so there wasn't you know, a fear of falling down the stairs with a lot of snow if the maintenance guys couldn't get there first thing in the morning to clear off the snow. So again, it's a pretty minor thing, but design-wise, it's actually huge because now you've got this stair poking out in the front of the building, and you've suddenly lost a place to sit and gather and have eyes on the street. So how do we still deal with that? Let people see what's out there and kind of patrol their front yard, and then yet still have that security. So we're working on areas to still sit in the front if you want to and be part of the street and yet have that same kind of security. So it seems like something really minor, but it's actually, as a design problem, it's quite difficult. So we're modeling the buildings in 3D, and again, these seem like really simple buildings, but it's actually quite complicated to get it right, because that connection, even like how far the building is set back from the sidewalk, where those steps are, where do you feel comfortable sitting above the sidewalk on your lot versus on the street you know, there are a lot of nuances in it, so we take that very seriously, and we're still working on it.
I think with us, I'll just do one quick example, which was that I mentioned yesterday how the counseling rooms ended up being on the windows, and originally, well, at least in the original design, they had been an interior room, and that really came out of the charrette and how important the nonprofits that were dealing with people who would be in those counseling rooms felt about natural light and being able to see nature of some kind, you know, from windows, and how restorative that would be for their clients. And so that was a really important change that came about totally based on what the students heard from their focus groups.
I'll just give one specific illustration of the process I mentioned, which works really well in design build too, where it's not design build, it's design build, redesign build. That's what I do, because I think that's where students learn. But if you saw, I went through it really fast, but there was a yellow roof that looked like Spanish tiles. Well, you had about 2 seconds to see it anyway. You can imagine. And it's interesting progression of how we came up with that. And this was for a migrant bathroom prototype. And one of the things we found that in the surveys that I talked about, that a lot of the bathrooms were very dark and didn't have fresh air, and they had really bad mildew problems. So one of the students designed a half-inch scale model, a Spanish tile roof made from barrels. All right, so that looks at half-inch like, oh great, let's build it, okay? So, but then then another team took it on, and we found those blue barrels that don't have parallel sides. We cut them in half, tried to put them together. It was a detailing nightmare. So that's the second iteration. But somebody said, you know, in the cotton mills in North Carolina, they have all these barrels, they have parallel sides, they come in all kinds of diameters and all kinds of colors. So that's the third person contributing an iteration. And so we found these yellow barrels that were like 2 feet wide. We cut them in half. We did the Spanish tile profile, and the roof was really too tall. But that was the fourth iteration. So the fifth iteration, we finally cut them in, and everybody, you know, a different person had each one of these ideas. Finally, we cut them into quarters. We attached them to the rafters on the ground, and the roof went up beautifully in like 2 hours. And, you know, it was a great solution to a light and airy bathroom. So no one person could have had all those ideas. So that was 5 people who had ownership and rose to the right occasion at the right moment with a creative solution, and to have that be the design result.
I'll just share one specific example too. And I talked earlier about a guide to street safety that we created for trans and gender nonconforming youth. Sometimes we work with groups and they like don't want to be part of the design process, or not that they don't want to, they don't know how, they insist they don't have an aesthetic or the vocabulary to talk about it, and we talk through that and give them the tools for really figuring out that, oh, they do, and they know how to tell a story to their constituents. This group that we worked with, Streetwise and Safe, they know how to tell a story, and they have an aesthetic, and they have a very like strong vision for design and the way that they kind of perceive their community and how they communicate with the world. And so that was a very hands-on process, much more hands-on than some of our other projects have been. And it took a long time, and it came time where the project was a month and a half over, deadline. And we were coming up with a title, and I think we had 4 meetings. I kept coming back to the office, and it was like, are you done? And I'm like, no, one more meeting, and we'll get it. And it was a slow process, but we spent, we devoted 3 or 4 meetings just to talking through titles, because if we didn't have that consensus and buy-in from that group, who really felt strongly about having a title to this project that really spoke to their community, the whole project would have been compromised. So again, kind of getting back to the theme of not the most efficient way to do things all the time, but when it comes to buy-in, worth the time, for sure.
Okay, so moving on to the third principle of promoting social equality through discourse that reflects a range of values. So how do you ensure that the discourse or conversations you have is inclusive of all the people who are providing feedback and being a part of the project? Are there any key strategies or pieces of advice that you would give to folks who are trying to start working this way?
I think listening is the key there. Being able to step back and not project your own ideas until you have fully listened to the voices that you're asking these questions to, which is a lot easier to say than to do, because as designers, I think especially, our minds immediately start running, and it can be really easy for us just to quickly make decisions and move forward on something when maybe that's not really the best solution. And I think what public interest design really forces us to do is to step back from that idea, slow the design process down a lot more than we would like, and really concentrate on, is this really answering the question that we proposed? Is this, have I reached all of those voices? And asking who the stakeholders are, instead of placing our designs just, as a Band-Aid over something. Because like I think Brian said yesterday, maybe the design isn't architecture that needs to come out of this. It could be something completely different. So anyway, that's I think what I've taken away from this whole process the most is you have to learn to listen, which can be really hard.
I would add to that. A lot of times when we have these meetings, we understand what our client or our user group really wants, and we want to please them, and we really want to figure out what their needs are and design for them. The hardest part is when we take our projects out to the more general public, and we get a lot of criticism back from them, and you have to sometimes step back and rethink what you're hearing from them. They may complain about one thing, and then if you start to hear it over and over, you start to think there's a bigger problem, and what is that problem that they're conveying to us that we should be addressing? And then how do we make that better? And it's hard because sometimes you hear that and you're like, but this is a great project. This is, we need to do this. Like, why are you opposed to this? And then, the more you listen to it, you start to understand, it's like, well, maybe our building is actually a little too tall for the context of this neighborhood. And maybe they're seeing that. Is there something else that we're not seeing because we're so focused on pleasing the residents in our user group and who we're designing for? So we have to do that. And sometimes it's hard because you're like, oh, why are you opposed to this? This is a good thing, but it's helpful to have those community meetings where they rip you apart and they tell you they don't like certain things for certain reasons. And then, after a day or two, you start thinking, okay, I understand what they're complaining about, and we need to rethink that.
There's a definition of leadership that I heard that I thought was really great because leadership, I think, has a lot of bad connotations. This definition is enabling capacity in others towards a specific purpose. And I think, I know designers have an incredible amount of power because we are the form makers, and a lot of things that happen in our brain, we don't, we make these decisions and we make the form, and that's a lot of power. And I think we need to be very aware of that and very careful with it, but I also think it gives us the ability to reallocate power in really important ways. And I think it's not just listening, but it's also recognizing who is not getting a voice in the conversation. Because I can listen to the person who shows up at my meeting and talks very eloquently and loudly, but guess what? That person has probably been involved in a lot of decisions throughout their life, and they know how to do it. What about the people that aren't there, that aren't speaking loud and a lot? And I think that's really the challenge here is for us, and that's sort of what the SEED process tries to do, is say who's not at this conversation that should be. And it's not a science, but it fortunately, sensitivity can be useful. And even in meetings, there's a saying, if you like to speak, step back. If you don't like to speak, step up. There are ways of trying to have people have equal voices. And I think that's a role we can play, which sounds like we're in power, but in fact we are kind of in power, and I think you just have to be very careful about what you take and what you give and who you give it to.
I don't have much to add to those very eloquent responses. I'm hunched over here. Apologies. No. Oh, okay. Perfect. Great. Except just a pragmatic consideration, which is like, how are you setting up the terms of inclusion? Like, what time are you holding your meetings? Can folks make it up during those times? Could you go to them? Could you take your feedback session on the road? Do these folks need something else to participate? Is that a translator? Is that a meal? Just asking yourself those questions and trying, it's hard, but trying to be rigorous about questioning the terms by which you're asking for feedback.
Great. So in terms of the fourth principle, building local capacity and growing from place, I thought, Greta, you had a good example of giving students kind of the ability to run the charrette, or leaving that decision, even though it was risky, to a different group or someone you wanted to see grow. I was wondering if anyone else kind of had a good example or a anecdote about maybe taking some risk and allowing for that growth to happen that they'd like to share. or speaking more to that situation with Sir Denton.
I have a quick story about that, which is, we work with graphic designers, illustrators, artists. Not everyone has the same skill set. And one of the most rewarding parts of working on the Making Policy Public series is right now we're working with a graphic designer who's a really strong information designer, knows how to set type and do really strong hierarchies of information and is really solid that way. Not an illustrator. And she was really clear about that to begin with. But we were comfortable just saying, let's see where this goes. And the more she talked to our community partner and the more we talked about tone and mood and feel and the kind of emotional vibe of this product we were trying to make, the more confident she felt trying to illustrate this. And that really came out of the collaborative process. And that was a risk we were willing to take, even though we knew that wasn't her strength from the beginning. We hoped that the process would kind of get there. That doesn't always happen or work out very well, but sometimes it does, yeah.
I'll tell a story. I don't know if it has anything to do with that question, but I like this story. So we were working in Asheville, and we had been invited to come to this neighborhood called Shiloh to do a bus shelter. And they had heard about other bus shelters we did, but they were an amazing community because they actually owned the property that the Biltmore mansion was on. Vanderbilt bought them out and moved them away from the French Broad River across the road. But essentially, they've been there longer than Vanderbilt had been. They've been there a long time. So they had a really wonderful sense of community, a lot of home ownership, but nobody knew where they were. So they didn't only want a bus shelter, they also wanted a landmark, and they also wanted an entry to this park that they had. So we're going along nicely, working with these a group of elderly citizens that would meet at the community center where we were. And it's a 7-week project with starting with a blank slate. And so we're about 3.5 weeks in, and we're having a meeting, and the policeman shows up and says, "You can't do this project here. The drug dealers will take it over." And this was a big guy, and I heard him bragging to somebody how much he could bench lift, super macho guy. And most of the people we were working with were women. So everybody was just knocked off our feet because we couldn't really start over. I mean, we were there to do a bus shelter. Anyway, so a couple things happened that I think was really interesting. First of all, one of the women said, "Well, we don't want drug dealers to determine the future of our community, so we're not sure that we're going to just stop this bus shelter. But maybe we'll go look for another site." So he, myself, and 2 of the women got in the car and we drove around the park. Meantime, one of the students goes out and talks to one of the drug dealers, okay? And he says, awesome guy, talk about a skill set, white guy, but went to an African-American public school, just had, was very comfortable going out and having conversation with these community members. They were members of this community, and he said, "If we build a bus shelter right there, will you guys take it over?" And they said, "Yes." And so he came back in, and we came back from our ride, and he reported that to us. And then we said, we found this other site down on the stream, a beautiful stream, and Shiloh means resting place. So we said, well, go out and ask them about that place. So we went out and asked them about this other place, and they said, no, we won't go over there. So sure enough, we build the bus shelter in this new place. We go back the next year, and we go to a neighborhood that had a lot of HUD housing and was considered pretty rough. And the police meets with us on day 1, first of all. And by the way, that policeman got in a lot of trouble for just interfering like that. But in the end of the day, it worked out to be a great project. Anyway, we go back the next year, and they say, oh, you can't do a bus shelter in this community. The drug dealers will take it over. And we said, seems like you said that to us last year. And they said, yeah. And we said, well, have the drug dealers taken over that bus shelter? And they said, no. And we said, well, have a little faith in the process. We'd love for you to participate throughout the whole thing. But anyway, it was, I don't know if it has anything to do with that, but it was a wonderful way of seeing this community. I don't know, just a good story.
Well, how did the second bus shelter fare?
Well, we didn't get as much, but we didn't have a wonderful group to work with that came for lunch every day. So I don't think actually this was, so a funny part of this was, the one thing we'd done in the first bus shelter was we went to the children's art class and had to make little tiles in Dixie cups with plaster, or I guess concrete, cement. And we used that for the flooring of the thing. Well, guess what? Nobody cared about our Luca Bond rabbit joint, roof. The community loved these little tiles. So we were having trouble getting participated the next year, but it was next to a gas station where pretty much everybody went, it was sort of a community gas station. So I had the students set up a table and talk about getting your elevator pitch down. They had the amount of time it took from somebody to walk from the gas pump to the front door to explain to them what we were doing and why they should come over and cast a little piece of floor for the new bus shelter. So they got really good. And we had 180 people cast tiles for the new bus shelter. So that's one thing we learned, is this quick exercise in being, making a part, and they could put anything except for gang symbols in the so.
And the fifth principle has, conserve resources, minimize waste. There's a environmental bent to that, and I feel like, Catherine, you touched on that with affordable housing, making sure that it integrated environmentally friendly and conservative practices in order for it to remain affordable. How else do you think about sustainability, think about waste, even in the process or in the product of what you guys have presented?
That one can be a little bit harder with new construction because, we're doing production work, so the contractor is going to build it in a certain way. When we do get clients that are open to looking at materials and looking at different processes, then we can be a little bit more free on that. We have a couple of projects where, as part of the rehab, the demolition of materials, we were able to reuse them in the new product in the new building. One was an SRO building that we rehabbed, and the floor joists that came out actually went to another organization called Rebuilding Exchange. Now there's Rebuilding Exchange and Rebuild Foundation. So Rebuilding Exchange, which also trains people in carpentry skills and how to build tables, things like that. So the materials came out, they had a training program, and then we made tables, coat hooks, panels for walls, and that was also a jobs program through Rebuilding Exchange. And then the other project was Rebuild Foundation, which is the Astor Gates. And a lot of the window lintels, these steel angles, were too small, so those all came out and got, those were all pulled aside, and then their team went and reused those they used stair treads or the nosing on stair treads, and then also for some furniture, and again, the wood was pulled out. But you really have to have a client who is willing to do that, and it's not always easy because we do have a set budget, and for the contractors to meet that budget, they often don't want to do that. So we work really hard to try and get as many partners involved in these projects as possible. And a side note to that too is like figuring out the budget, how to do that. Like, say we want to hire an organization like Architreasures to do a tile mosaic. We can't get that line item in the budget, but we can say tile, and then there's an allowance for tile, and then that's Architreasures to come in and they'll do a mosaic. So sometimes you just have to be creative and have to push the client sometimes to think a little bit outside the box on how to do these types of things.
For ours, we had a building that we already had, so that in itself is a step forward, I think. So anytime, and I love new build stuff, so I can't say don't do new builds. But especially with interiors design, we do mostly, we'll come into an existing space and then have to work with that. But that really pushes you, I think, too, to look at what are some resources that you have within the community that maybe could be utilized in a different way. And so that was, in addition to they wanted it to be a sustainable building in the end, just kind of a step in the right direction. I felt that, not only was it a benefit to the organization because they didn't have to pay for an entirely new structure, but it was beneficial to the environment that we weren't completely tearing it down and building something on top of it.
So I just want to mention a key difference between LEED and SEED. LEED, as you probably know, is a checklist, and you're encouraged to get more points because you get a different color prize. And so I think that's a dangerous incentive. And I don't agree that there should be a checklist like that. I mean, Butaro has some wonderful environmental principles of using local stone. Could it be LEED certified? I doubt it. And so I think to kind of leave it open and to say, what is the environmental response appropriate for your community and within your priorities, I think it's a much more genuine, open conversation. And so I think that's one thing that SEED does, is sort of just has a blank piece of paper. You tell us what your performance measures are and why they're important to the community. And maybe it's about making local jobs and creating craftsmen who can make beautiful walls out of this volcanic stone that happens to be nearby. So I think it just goes back to not encouraging over-promising. So it goes back to Eric's question, can you do a simple seed project? Absolutely, as long as you did what you said you're going to do. If it's 4 eggs a week and it costs $600 and that's what you said you were going to do, cha-ching, right? So I think that's important, not to overpromise, and I think that's a problem with LEED, besides the fact that it's super expensive.
And this is my final question before I open it up to all you guys, so I hope you have your questions ready. But how do you feel being involved in these types of projects in public interest design and public interest design-esque type of work? How do you feel that that's being accepted or utilized in the design, architecture, or planning professions? And how do you see it growing? Or do you see it growing in the future? How do you see it being accepted based on your experience? Whoever wants to start. It's a big one, so whoever wants to start.
I'll start again on that one. Maybe one of the biggest compliments we had was a friend of mine was in town and he was going to be in the south side of Chicago. And I said, well, we've got a project down there. If you drive by, you'll see it. And he drove by. He's like, so what'd you think? And he's like, I don't know. I didn't see it. I just saw some condos. It's like, well, that was that was it. That was the affordable housing project that you missed. But so sometimes that's a goal of ours, is that it's not going to stand out. These aren't going to be. We're not Starchitects. These aren't going to be these buildings that stand out on the block, but they're going to add to the context of the neighborhood, and they're hopefully going to contribute to the overall effect. And I think we do get some awards. It's a specialized award, the Driehaus Award in Chicago, but good design is still valued in these communities. They do look favorably on this, knowing that here's a building that's been built in their neighborhood that is of value, and people do understand that. But as far as the bigger architectural community, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if these could stand up and win more major AIA awards. Plus, we probably don't photograph them quite the same. I think Ingrid's photo of, our buildings usually have people in them, not just the sterile building by itself. We also like people to change our buildings. We have one that's a townhouse, and the bays are all painted the same color, and then we went back a couple years later, and they're all painted green, but they're all a different green color. It was awesome. It just looked really great, because that meant people liked their building and they're personalizing it, and that's huge. So yeah, go ahead, change the building that I designed. I'm happy to see you personalize it, because that means to me that you care about it and you're going to take care of it in a different way.
I sit on a chapter board for the Texas-Oklahoma International Interior Design Association. And we were at our chapter retreat this summer, and the question was raised of, what should our organization be getting involved in? And I immediately piped up and said, oh, I would love to see us more involved in public interest design. And it was like crickets. And so I was like, you have never heard of public interest design? And so it was an opportunity to share then what this is all about. And everyone was like, oh, well, that sounds kind of cool. And how would we do that? So I think anytime you have the opportunity within whatever your professional organizations are, you know, a lot of people just they don't know it exists, or they might be doing some form of it and don't know that there's this whole support network with probably great ideas that might expand upon what they are doing. So I think just being open and having the conversation will help expand the role of this greatly. But I think I mean, you know, I brought Brian to UNT for what I thought was just going to be a lecture, and here we are talking about having something more in that. So, you know, there's a lot going on, and when you get the momentum behind it, you just don't know where it will go. So I would just encourage you all to talk about it, and I think it's moving. You know, it keeps getting bigger. There are more publications. A lot of people are very interested in this. Certainly at the Interior Design Educators conferences, we are often talking about service learning or community learning experiences within our education programs, and those get tons of people at them because they're like, how do we do this and how do we get more engaged? Because I think we see the value in it. So I think it's on the up.
Just anecdotally, someone asked about CUP's business model during my session, and I should have mentioned we do a little bit of technical assistance work, so you can hire us to help you with the project, and we still have the same collaboration model and make sure there's a connection to the community and all of that. But I think, you know, initially we're pretty niche, we're pretty the weirdos in the public interest design world. But I think initially we used to get those kinds of requests from like city planning agencies, you know, architects, kind of the usual suspects in this world. And now we're starting to get requests from like the Department of Health and like small business services and libraries. And so the kinds of inquiries we're getting about the work we do are, the sectors are really expanding. It's much more interdisciplinary than it used to be. So I take that as a really good sign. That once you can kind of start to articulate, the trouble is, and that's why it's great, you know, that these folks are here to talk about this. Once you can kind of start to articulate your mission, people seem to be listening and clearly seeing the need for it.
So I have two thoughts. One is what Catherine's saying about the quality of public interest design. I think Catherine would agree that it's come a long way, and I think that it had a stigma 20 years ago, but I think that statistic that 90% of AIA members felt there was no conflict of doing public interest design and doing your best work. That's wonderful, and I'm saying this because I'm saying that we need talent. We need you all to come with your A game and your best design skills, and we need it to be as high quality as anything else. So. That's changed a lot, and I think we'll continue to, and I think the more we show more work and more people doing it, it just keeps getting better. The second thing I wanted to say, though, is it has to do with what CUP's doing in a sense that, let me think this through. So design is, I mean, we shouldn't just be about design. We should be about, you know, global challenges and how we can make a difference. And I think that you can call it politics if you want, but how are we engaged and how are we, sorry, I'm trying to articulate this, it's kind of tough. You know, Peter Eisenman says that design is not political. And I think somebody who says that is really just saying that he endorses the status quo, because he's just accepting whatever, he's not taking a position, he's not trying to change the status quo, he's not realizing the type of empowerment policy information that CUP is doing. So I think that there's a relationship between being an engaged citizen and being responsible and not accepting the status quo, and design is certainly a part of that, but I just think we all need to be engaged citizens, basically.
And with that, I'll open it up to any questions while you have our four amazing folks on the stage.
So, what I've learned in life so far is that people can adapt to almost anything. So people have a tendency to make the best out of the worst situation. And as you go in to do public interest design, are you all seeing people's tendency to put lipstick on a pig, or more wanting something, like they realize how far off where they currently are, whatever situation they've been put in is off, and they can really see, all right, let's go back to zero and get to where we may have should have been, or are they just trying to really put fixes on a pig, you know? So what are you guys seeing when you're out there in the field?
Well, I don't think there's one, some do a lot better than others. I mean, I love, again, going back to Bayview, just such an amazing story about a community that didn't have much, but they had their community, and they fought for it, and they got allies. They got an environmental justice award with the Sierra Club to fight the prison. They stopped the prison. Finally, they brought the governor to his knees, and he came out there like, what do you all need? And they're like, here's our vision for our community. So I don't think it gets much better than that. They had sewage in the street. They had a I don't even think it was a pig. They didn't have a pig. It was a bad situation, and the jobs had left. But basically the water table was so high, all the septic just backed up and flowed into the street all the time. So it was a bad health situation, bad housing situation. So for that community to get together and work with a designer and envision their new community not just based on a new sort of thing, but based on their traditions and their history and their culture, I mean, I don't think it gets much better than that.
I think that's an excellent question, because I think that the impulse can be to not open things. If you're a planner staring down an angry community who's been neglected for a long time, you're afraid to open things up, right? You don't want to set yourself up for that hurt. But I think that and that's sympathetic, right? It's a tough job to do, to go into communities that have been continually, neglected or promised things that never happened. What we often find is that the community groups we work with are never asked to kind of imagine. It's just they kind of assume that what's on the table is what's on the table. And I think that part of this field is to be willing to kind of help people imagine beyond what they're typically kind of given, what the status quo is, to go back to the concept of the status quo, that can be a really powerful role that you can play as well. A dangerous one, right, too, because, opening up folks' imaginations to, bigger problems means that, you're making yourself and the folks you're working with vulnerable to disappointment, but that's the reality that we're working in, so.
So I know you guys touched on this briefly earlier, but what would y'all suggest be kind of an entry point for studio artists, graphic artists, visual artists to kind of take part in this kind of movement? I know it's really early on and it's centered mostly around architecture, but what's kind of something that we can do, whether it's connections that we can maybe figure out and find out, whether it's certain even if we're still in school, degree programs that might be helpful. What's something that we can do to get more involved and make it a lot more about the arts as well as architectural design?
I think you should look up Theaster Gates. I lived with him for a year, which wasn't as exciting as everybody probably thinks it is, but so he's everything, but he uses his art in very out-of-the-box ways. Like one example was there were empty lots. I don't even remember what city it was. Let's say St. Louis, and he would put sculptures in the empty lots and sell them to people because nobody was taking care of these empty lots. So now you owned a Theaster Gate, so you took care of the lot. So it's that sort of like leveraging he's a performance artist, very, very political, but the most inclusive experience I ever have is watching him perform, because at the end of these performances, you can say, we can all talk about anything after that. It's just so, anyway, he's a very creative, it's just, I don't know what type of art you're interested in, and he doesn't define his in any particular way, but I think it will open your eyes about what art can do. Also look at Sambo Mockby's art. I think he he liked to say you have to court the muses to sort of keep your creativity going, but I think he was really also trying to establish the poetry of the communities he was serving. So I think giving voice to poetry, I'm not saying you might want to follow that model, but it does sort of, it has a context, but it does give a perception of a community that they might not have had of themselves. So those are two thoughts I have.
I have a good friend that lives in Scotland who does a lot of, he wouldn't term it public interest design because he just wouldn't, but he works with communities in his artwork and focuses a lot on placemaking, which I think is kind of an easy entry point for, I think, an artist or someone, you know, that's a topic that can be grappled with pretty easily. And but he involves the community and storytelling is a huge part of that. And just, you know, again, sitting there listening and trying to bridge the gap between the old and the young and what needs to happen within the community and then translating that into an artifact of some kind, whether it's an installation in the town center or they just completed these words that were around the town square that the community came to as kind of, they came to realize them as very much significant to their community, and they're now reminders, like they cast them in stone and did some other things. So anyway, it was just an interesting, he's always doing interesting work. That's not a building, but it is very much involving the community and reaching out to them in some way. And there's a lot of, at least over in Scotland, they get grant money to go out and do this. So, you know, you might look into that and see if there's something, you know, that, but I would say whatever resounds with you too. I mean, it has to be, I think, a passion for any of us is what we're doing to make it meaningful. And so if there's something you're particularly interested in, maybe find a nonprofit group that has that same, you know, I guess, thought process or influence and has the group that you know, the clientele that you would like to work with and see what comes of it. You don't have to have a plan. You can just go have a conversation and see where it leads.
Just a quick comment on the Astor. So last week there was a panel discussion with David Adjay, British architect, and the Astor Gates was on the panel, and a topic came up. It says you can be a visitor or you can be a host, and I think perfectly of the Astor. He's not a visitor. He's always the host, and just being able to welcome people into your world. And if you look at his early projects, that's how he started. He was always a host. He was always inviting people to be part of presentations, opening his doors to parties or events or his backyard the neighborhood kids would run through. So again, be a visitor, be a host, be a host.
Just related to that, is there a clearinghouse, or not a clearinghouse, are there any listings of, like by city? Does CEED have a list of organizations that do public interest kind of work? So if I lived here in Dallas, I could go look up organizations here that did that and perhaps volunteer?
You know, we have that information, but we haven't made it accessible yet. I'm sorry. We do want to look at breaking down the network by geography and by issue-based interest. That's probably 5.0, but you know, it's a great way to encourage communication or communities to form.
Would a resource like ACD be a good start in terms of, I think they list organizations on a state level, and you might be able to find some folks to get involved with. And also, going back to the art question.
The website's communitydesign.org.
Excellent. Going back to the art question, in terms of an entry point, you might approach a community first as a concerned community member with an artistic skill. And then once you identify an issue or a project that they would be interested in, bring that artistic skill to the table or have that project in mind that you could include them in and maybe get started with them, I think is a good way to think about it. If you don't have an organization behind you or funding behind you, just kind of self-initiating a relationship might be a good way to get something started. Just wanted to put a thought on that. Any other questions? Over there.
So we've spoken about, I guess, getting involved more on the nonprofit side. Do you guys have any recommendations of starting to steer a traditional firm into incorporating more youth principles?
Yeah, it's easy. Well, it's easy and it's hard. I think you can always have these principles in the back of your mind as you're designing. We've actually tried to start kind of our own kind of wheel of these types of ideals to start the conversation with a client, but you have to be really conscious of that when you start talking to them. Like, have these on the table and have these in front of you as you talk, because otherwise it somehow jumps to a plan, or you like start doing the zoning right away, and well, we can get 15 units and we can do this. It's like, well, why don't we start with this list and let's talk about the broad ideas first. But you can do that with any project, right? You just have, it's just a mental change in how you start the project, and start with that list instead of, again, just jumping into a zoning analysis and code analysis and just kind of designing from there.
I would say make a deal. I mean, just like, I did with Rural Opportunities. Go to your boss and say, we do X amount of pro bono work per year. How would you feel if I invested that pro bono time into the upfront of a project that could generate a fee later on? Or if he doesn't do pro bono, say, how about if the office is a partner in this project and I'll work on Saturdays, but if the first project generates a fee, from then on, I get 10 hours a week to work on public interest design. So figure out what resources, or say to your boss, how much does it cost us to get a project? They might know. I mean, $10,000 to $12,000 is, a figure I heard. So you say, well, if I can get a project, would you invest $10,000 to $12,000 for me to get a public interest design project if it was going to generate a fee? We've talked about a lot of tools, but you've got to sort of have a conversation so that the firm's interest is being met. You can't just be a non-sustainable drain on them. But there's plenty of negotiating room in here in what we've talked about so far to make a good offer, to try something out, see if it would work. But what do you put on the table? Are you giving up Saturdays? You can't just have everybody else give something and you not. You've got to figure out what you can put in to make it work. You probably need to put in more than anybody else's, because at the moment it's your great idea for what you want to do. Fair enough. Hopefully pretty soon other people will see the value for themselves also.
Coming from a background of non-art, non-design, but more like applied social research, how do you see research's role in this, or what does design bring to research, or vice versa? I guess do you see a role for research specifically in this process for people that kind of already address some of these issues, but maybe not on the front end and not the solution side?
So we're about to launch Seed Consultants, and it's firms that have demonstrated that they understand the full seed process. And guess what? These firms market themselves as being seed consultants, and they bring a value to any project that has public or foundation funding, which is a lot of projects. So that sort of research, that sort of performance measurements, all the skills that I think you're learning would be a very valuable part of that team that is generating income for that firm. So that's, we're doing a beta test with 4 firms that will start in about a month, and we'll see how it goes from there. But it's marketable skills. It's sort of in between nonprofit, government, and architecture firms, but I think maybe nobody has that combined skill set that you do.
I would jump in and say that in addition to, co-designing and thinking about how to integrate community members into your design process, there are also great models for integrating community members into your research process. And I'm thinking specifically of something like participatory action research, which is a model for bringing your expertise as a practitioner, but also thinking about the research process as part of a the design continuum, right? And making sure that the communities that you're working with are part of that process too. So that's something I'd throw out there.
All through the 2 days, each of the presenters who have shared lots of valuable resources. Some of which is identified in the materials you provided, but would it be possible to consolidate all your references and put together a list and share with the group?
Well, we're gonna ask the speakers to put their presentations in a Dropbox. They don't have to, but we'll share that with everybody. You'll get an email in probably a week, that also shows the results of the survey to hold us accountable on how we did. But yeah, so I'm not sure we'll cover everything that was raised, but you will have access to some of the presentations.
And we are recording the event as well,
There you go.
so we'll have documentation of each of the lectures and presentations and panels. I can't give you a date that they'll be available, but they will in the near future. And feel free to follow up with myself or Brian. You can contact me at elizabeth@bcworkshop.org at any time. And with that, I want to kind of finish this panel, or at least give them a round of applause so that we can kind of move on to the next.